Another use for double processing the same raw file is single exposure exposure blending. Exposure blending is typically done when the full dynamic range in the scene can't be recorded in a single exposure without blowing out the highlights and clipping the shadows. So what you do in the field is bracket 2 or more exposures and then blend them together to create a single image that contains the full dynamic range. But there are times when the exposure blending concept can be useful even when you've captured the full dynamic range in a single exposure. Sometimes you can't find a single set of exposure adjustments that are optimal for both the sky and the landscape at the same time. There are other times when you might want to create a different color balance or clarity in the sky and the land, and extreme highlight and shadow recovery at the same time in Lightroom or Camera Raw can sometimes create halos or edge issues along the horizon. You can use the brush or graduated filter tools in Lightroom and Camera Raw to separate sky and land adjustments, but if I'm going to do that anyway, then I prefer to do it here in Photoshop with Photoshop's superior selections and masks. I've covered the double raw processing exposure blend extensively in other courses, so I'll just give it a quick demo here. This image is a pretty extreme example. The amount of shadow recovery it needs can create serious noise issues unless you're using a camera that has really good shadow recovery capabilities. This was taken with a Canon EOS R, so it does pretty well. The Canon R5, as well as many of the Sony and Nikon cameras, can do even better, and who knows what you might be using in the future. It would have been better to take 2 exposures in the field, but if you didn't, or something in the scene was moving, then this technique can be your best option. You start by creating a copy of the raw smart object using new smart object via copy. And then I'm going to come into the background layer, which will be our land exposure. And in Camera Raw, I'm going to expose this for the land. So I'm going to bring the exposure up quite a ways. I'm also going to bring up the blacks and the shadows and kind of just open things way up. And then I'm going to bring the exposure back down right to the edge where it feels like what the proper exposure value for that scene was. And then I'm going to bring the highlights down a bit just so that this upper part of the image will blend better with the sky exposure. I don't have to get this all exactly perfect right now because we can come back to it and fine tune it once we create the blend. So we'll start with that. And so there's our foreground exposure, our landscape exposure. Now I'm going to open up the sky exposure and we'll adjust this one to optimize the sky. Bring the exposure down a ways, certainly bring the highlights down to recover what was lost in this part of the sky. And I'm going to bring up the shadows to lighten up that dark part of the sky. Bring up the blacks a bit too, and maybe bring down the contrast a little bit. Somewhere in there. And I'll click, well, let's see, make sure I fully recover those highlights, and we'll go okay with that. And now we need a blending mask to blend the sky exposure with the landscape exposure. And it's tempting to use Photoshop's Select Sky feature to create that mask. And in some cases, it can do a good job, but a lot of the time I find that it's too hard edge of a mask. So for example, with that sky selection, if we put that mask on this top layer to do the blend, it looks okay, but I find that right along the horizon, the exposure values just really don't blend. It needs to feather a bit more. You could work on hand feathering that edge, but I find that creating a blending mask based on luminosity masks using the TK panel works the best. So go ahead and get rid of that mask. And I'm going to get this mask made from the lighter exposure. And we'll start with a lights 1. And let's see. There's a lot of similar tones in the sky and in the land, so it's going to be a little tricky, but I think we can do it. So we'll start by darkening the land a little bit, and then trying to bring up the sky with the white slider. So just creating better separation between the sky and the land. Somewhere in there might be getting closer. Maybe there. And then I'll grab the black brush tool and use that to just paint my whole foreground out here entirely black. But I want to be careful because I want this to feather up into that transition zone. So something like that. Then I can grab the white brush and paint white across the sky up here. And the tricky spot is right here where these clouds in the landscape match. So I don't want to go light down into the landscape. Let's see if I can bring up the highlights in the sky a little bit more and bring down the darkness of the land a little bit more. And then at this point, I'm going to go over to rapid mask mode because I have a few more options there for modifying this mask. And one of those options is the curves adjustment, which I can use to further lighten the sky and darken the land, but I still want to maintain that feathering there as best I can. And then at some point I can now come to the dodge tool and see if I can use that to dodge out these highlights without overlapping into the land. So maybe there. Hopefully that's going to do it. So now I'm going to output that mask onto this layer. And we'll turn on the sky. And we'll see how that blend looks. And yeah, that is a more natural blend. It blends down the landscape better. And I can also still come and do a little bit with first a low opacity, low flow white brush. And just make a pass along here to extend the blend. And I can switch over to a black brush and kind of sweep along here. And I'm just feathering that transition so that it looks as natural as possible. And I think that's a pretty good job. And that looks good already, but now that I have that blending mask, I can come into each exposure and fine tune the layers. So for example, let's come into the sky. And I might actually want to warm the sky up and actually get a little warmer color palette going on in there. And I might also want to work with clarity a little bit to clarify the sky, and maybe a little bit of dehaze for some drama. And maybe a little bit up with the exposure, down with the highlights, just fine tuning it. Yeah, I like that in the sky. Now let's come into the landscape and see what we can do. I think in the land, I actually want to bring up my blacks a little bit, bring down the contrast a little bit, and then bring down the overall exposure. I really want it to feel nice and dark in there, but I don't want the blacks to be getting too blocked up. So somewhere in there. And then I think I'm going to actually bring the overall color temperature of the foreground down. And then I also want to bring up the texture and the clarity in the landscape slightly. And then check this out. I'm going to come into the graduated filter and drag a filter up in the sky and reset that filter. And I'm going to use the luminance range mask and visualize it. And I'm going to use this to try to target the highlights in the landscape. So just the tops of these hoodoos and formations, because I just want to add a little bit of warmth into those areas because they were picking up that light from the sky. So we can turn off the visualizer. And now we'll bring up the temperature and the tint a little bit in there. And yeah, I think that is going to do it. So let's go ahead and click OK and see how that blends when it all updates. And I actually think I can push that concept in the foreground a little bit more. So we'll come back in to that graduated filter, and I'm actually going to lighten it a bit and bring up the yellows and the magentas even a bit more. And then maybe work with the range a little bit more just to really try to hit the tops of those areas. And yeah, let's go with that. Yeah, that looks nice. So that's how you go about double raw process exposure blending. And as good as the dynamic range of cameras is getting, being able to do actual exposure blending is still a useful skill to have. So in the final chapters of this course, we're going to take the exposure blending concept further to see how raw smart objects are the most powerful tool for blending two or more actual exposures.